sometimes in the most crude way, that this means that there is misery in the north and everyone in the south is very cheerful and happy. But that's not necessarily the case, and there hasn't, as far as we know, been that much research actually trying to figure out exactly what the consequences of what is rather a big economic divergence between North and South in recent decades. And so we set out to look at this in very broad terms. I'm going to start by looking at the regional economic divergence and a few indicators we've compiled. And for this, I'm going to look at this north-south divide of Britain. So the south includes these 4 regions, including London, but I'll also be separating out London in most of the graphs so that you can see how London compares with the rest of the south. And what the rest of the south looks like without London. Wales is going to be included in the north, and then Scotland is going to be treated separately. So that was a slide I borrowed from the ONS. ONS is where some of this data comes from, including this series about productivity relative to the UK average. This slide runs from 1900 to 2020, but most of what I'll be showing you is just for the years 1980 to 2020, or just after 1980, because that's where most of our survey data starts in the early 1980s. So in all these graphs, I'll show you the blue line is the south, the black line is the north, the orange line is Scotland, and then when we split out London, London is the green dashed line, and to show you the rest of the south, excluding London, it's the blue dashed line. And we've got more complicated dashes here because there's actually 2 time series that are not quite the same thing, but they're broadly measures of an equivalent concept. And they show a very long-running gap between north and south, with the north less productive and poorer than the south, and that gap widening over recent decades as the north falls further behind the UK average. And that's a well-known story. You can also see it in household income per head. Here again, now we're on the 1980 to 2020 scale. That gap between the south above average and the north below average has widened. And if we separate out London, you can see one of the key sources of widening is that incomes in London have been going on up, especially and in a runaway way relative to the UK average, and the south actually slightly lower than that. To be fair, this is about place of work rather than place of residence, and some of the people up here will be commuting into London for those big incomes. Now, one of the implications of income growth in London is that it's not all equal and across the distribution of incomes within these regions. So if we look at the 10th percentiles, which are down here, there's actually not that much regional variation. But if we come up here and we have the 90th percentiles for each region, you can see that the 90th percentile in London has gone up much faster in terms of gross annual income than it has in the rest of the south and north. So the north-south gap hasn't widened that much here, but I suppose when you're talking about tens of thousands of pounds, this is an important widening, and it's a lot due to London. Related to that, with people having more money, they can afford to buy bigger houses, and you see house prices over this period have diverged enormously between regions, with London way ahead of the rest. We couldn't properly combine our data on house prices in quite the same way, but you can see the 4 southern regions have all consistently had higher house prices and faster rising house prices than the northern regions and Scotland. So wealth, this as an indicator of wealth, an important part of people's wealth. You've got house prices going up. It also shows you something of an increase in costs for people in these regions who are not owning but renting, and I'll come back to that issue soon. A further indicator of regional differences in economic outcomes is unemployment, and unemployment actually tells a rather different story. Now, on unemployment, what you've got is a story of convergence between regions, which is largely driven by the fact that unemployment on average has been dropping over the period. It's gone up and down with recessions, but the gap that we saw between North and South unemployment in the early 80s recession has come down considerably to be a much smaller gap, and the overall level of unemployment in the Great Recession following the financial crisis was much smaller. So in an important respect that people care about deeply, job security and the chance of having a job, the gap between North and South is actually smaller than it used to be. Just want to go back to make one point that I don't think I made properly about the percentiles. The implication of these rising and faster rising incomes at the top of the distribution in London and the South is that you have greater inequality, and more inequality in the South relative to the North is not necessarily a positive divergence for the South in the way that we might normally say that increasing prosperity in the South is positive divergence for the South. So we, in some senses, have different trends in economic experiences and the nature of economic divergence, depending on which indicator we look at. So if what's important is income and wealth, then we have north-south divergence, and that might have led to north-south divergence on well-being, political alienation, political values, and a bunch of things I'm going to talk about in a moment. But if we've got narrowing unemployment gaps between North and South, that might have actually worked to produce some sort of convergence between North and South. And finally, if we have faster rising inequality in the South, and especially London, you might even see worsening outcomes in those regions relative to what we see in the North, rather than improving outcomes. So we have different possibilities in different directions. And actually, I'm not going to be doing a sort of more traditional social science paper of formally delineating lots of hypotheses and testing those hypotheses. I'm going to be looking very broadly about what's going on overall and cast the net quite wide in terms of different outcomes. And there are just too many variables and too many mechanisms that might be at play to delineate everything. But nonetheless, I think it's helpful to have this broader perspective over time and over different features, so we know more about what's going on. So the main theme, though, when I do talk about these is that economic prosperity is often thought to produce better outcomes in terms of health and happiness. It's leading people to be more comfortable and trusting of people in their neighborhood and environment. It's associated in the political behavior literature with political interest, political participation, and political engagement more broadly. Often positive evaluations of the political system, and a generally healthier civic culture for democracy. In terms of attitudes to politics and values and what people want from the state, economic prosperity and some of the things that go with economic prosperity are often linked with greater liberalism, economic laissez-faire values, a reduced demand for redistribution, as people who are better off tend to need redistribution or want less, and might be on the paying for end of any redistribution. And those factors are often lead to support for the Conservative Party, which traditionally over most of this period that we'll be talking about have been the party most strongly associated with the middle class and with looking after the interests of business. Now, when these kinds of mechanisms play out, they can play out in different ways for regions. There can be compositional effects. The more richer people you have, the more rich the region overall will be. And so traits of the rich will be more prevalent in the region as a whole when we aggregate up to the regional level. We can also have contextual effects where the effect of living in a richer region has some implication for the people in that region. And we might be thinking at this point as well about contextual effects of inequality, as well as overall prosperity in the region. And we can have cross-level interaction effects. So inequality might, as a context, a feature of the context, might have a negative overall effect, like as Wilkinson and Pickett, I think, in the Spirit Level book argued that just living in a more unequal society was negative, but it might have particularly negative implications for the people at the bottom of that income distribution in that society, rather than the people at the top who might benefit from inequality because they get cheaper labor for cleaners and so on. So you might have different effects of context depending on individual level characteristics. And if most people are not benefiting from the success at the top, when you aggregate up to the regional level, it might be that what happens at the bottom half or bottom 80% of the income distribution might be the driving effect of a regional pattern, even though it's much more complicated with cross-level interactions. So on one level, I probably am taking up too much time talking about all these detailed things going on, and I realize I've left another one out, which I'll talk about later, which is migration. But it's worth, I think, bearing in mind that there might be different things driving these things, and it's all worth trying to unpick in more detail later on. But there is already lots of papers in the literature trying to unpick some of these things in some of the, with respect to some of the variables I'll be talking about. Now, most of the data I'll be using for the social outcome variables are from the British Social Attitudes Survey, which is the best and long-running time series of social attitudes measurement in Britain. We also use the health survey for England for the health and well-being measures because they're not so strong and consistent in the British social attitudes. When we break this down, these data down by region, there are sampling issues that mean we have tried to improve estimates by age and education interaction weighting, further weighting for regional distributions of age and education. We have a few missing years on some of the series, which we've interpolated if they're not that many, but you'll see some very jumpy lines when we can't do interpolation because it would just be too misleading. And even with interpolation and even when nearly the whole series is there every year, we use 5-year moving averages to smooth over some of the noise, which is what we think is just sampling. So bear that in mind, that there's some smoothing going on when you interpret trends and bends. They might not be happening quite exactly when they appear, and we're looking for very broad and consistent patterns rather than wanting to look into very great detail at exactly what's going on at very specific time points. To start with well-being, as mentioned that we're looking at the health survey for England, so this is just England, so we don't have Scotland. This is a measure of poor health from a 12-item indicator of self-assessed health, which includes a lot of questions on mental as well as physical health. And people's health was on average getting better until the financial crisis, and then started getting worse again. And we do have a north-south divide in health, but interestingly not at the beginning of this period. And also interestingly, London is up there with the north as having the worst health, and not on par with the south, which has better health outcomes. Now, if the regional economic divergence made a difference, it didn't have much implication apart from this anomalous period at the beginning, which we don't fully understand. More specifically, one question in the health questionnaire is about whether you feel happy. This is recent happiness relative to the norm, but still we think this is probably indicative of general happiness and things changing. And here we have seen more of a divergence between the north with worse outcomes than the south. But if you look at the scale, and while the x-axis scales are going to stay pretty constant, the y-axis scales are changing. So be very sensitive as you look at these slides to the scale. These are not big differences, and so there isn't an awful lot going on here, even though there has been a bit of divergence in the way we'd expect. Moving on to political engagement and alienation, trust is normally higher amongst people who are more affluent and more educated. But the main thing that's been going on is that there's been a big drop in both the north and the south, and the size of the gap between the south and the north has fluctuated a bit. It's maybe widened up a bit in recent years with the north at record low levels, but it's not exactly huge, just a couple of percentage points. And this is an indicator of civic culture. If people have strong democratic norms, they normally say they feel that there's a duty to vote, and Scotland is quite high on this. That was dipping and it's gone back up again. There was nearly no difference between north and south, but that has been a widening. But again, the gap is about 5 percentage points. It's not huge what it's widened to. Here we have the percentage supporting no party, often used as an indicator of alienation from party politics and the political system. People might be familiar with a general story that there's been a decline in party identification. And you can see that here. This is one indicator. It's also the case that strength of party identification has been weakening as well, as I'll show you in a moment. The north-south gap, however, in support, in having no support for no political party, has typically been very, very small. It's widened out to getting on to 5 percentage points, but still not very big. And here you see in Scotland this drop being bigger as people become more and more engaged in Scottish politics, particularly in with the debate about independence. Again, you see that in interest in politics in Scotland just after the referendum, interest in politics, which was at a level on par with places in the north of England and Wales. But Scotland has moved up considerably in terms of levels of interest in politics. In terms of the north-south divide, the main north-south divide, it's been pretty constant, even though interest in politics has been going up over time. So as a measure of civic engagement in politics, we don't have a story of regional divergence here between north and south. Moving on to political values, the first thing we're going to look at is percentage on the left. This is a multiple indicator scale of socialist versus laissez-faire values, and this is the percentage of people to the left-hand side of that on average. Most people given these questions are on the left, but the degree to which they're on the left has changed somewhat over time. And with some of these economic indicators, you see a bit of a cycle whereby people become more left-wing under Conservative governments, become less left-wing under Labour governments, and then revert back again. So to make it a bit easier to see what's going on, here is the same stuff, but different, but where we set everything relative to the national average of 0, and national, here I mean GB average of 0. And here you can see there was a substantial gap between North and South that has narrowed over time. And it's become much smaller. And one of the key reasons why the North-South divide has narrowed is because London, which used to be middling, despite always being richer, has become clearly one of the most left-wing regions of Britain. And this is socialist laissez-faire issues. So we'd expect, in line with traditional economic theory, more left-wingness in poorer regions, and that's traditionally what we did find with North and South, but London doesn't fit that story very neatly, and it might be because of inequality within London rising faster than elsewhere. In terms of liberalism, it's commonly known that London is more liberal and has become increasingly so. But it's also true that everywhere has become more liberal. And this is a 5-item scale again, and this is a percentage on the liberal side. And regions were muddling along here, and then they suddenly become a lot more liberal. The gap has widened, and if we look at this relative to the GB average, you can see the North-South, and particularly the London North gap has widened, with the North being more socially conservative or authoritarian, and London being more liberal. But London now is not much more liberal relative to the GB average than it was in the 1980s by this measure. And I should flag up this measure is more sort of classic Mill type liberalism, freedom of speech stuff, but also death penalty. It doesn't have anything to do with immigration, even though it strongly predicts immigration attitudes. And we could talk about Brexit later. What we've got here is something that might naturally follow on from being left-wing or being liberal, and that is Conservative Party support. Now, as I said before, we might expect the North to be less conservative because it's poorer and less interested in redistribution. It's less left-wing. The South is more right-wing, therefore you'd expect it to be more conservative, and that's what we see relative to the GB average, and this is remarkably consistent. Even though we know in the post-Brexit referendum period, the South the North has famously, with the Red Wall, supposedly become much more conservative. That isn't kicking in here because the data end at the end of 2018, and so we don't have the 2019 general election kicking in here yet. But still, even before that, there's a remarkable consistency, and this won't change that much with the very latest data. On the Labour side, however, there's more sign of convergence relative to the GB average. You've got the North being more Labour, the South being less Labour, but the South, particularly under Blair and New Labour, warmed to them and closed the gap between North and South. But there have been two other dramatic things here. Scotland started off as the most Labour voting part of Britain at the beginning of the 80s, ended up as the least Labour and obviously most SNP voting part of Britain. London, another trajectory, was round about the middle for most of the time period, and then from the early 2000s has become progressively strongly Labour leaning, and we're about to see a Greater London Assembly and mayoral election next week, where it's widely anticipated that the Labour mayor will be comfortably re-elected, and it seems to be increasingly a one-party city. So there's a really mixed story there in terms of north-south gaps. On most of the civic culture and well-being things, the north-south gaps have been remarkably modest and changes have been modest, so there hasn't been so much divergence, despite really big economic divergence in terms of incomes at least. And some of the patterns of change in other indicators, not just the ones here, are actually in the opposite direction from what you might normally expect. We have very particular stories about Scotland and the rise of nationalism, which might ultimately be economically related, because it did take off after the discovery of North Sea oil, and started with a campaign about it being Scotland's oil. That's another story. London is more interesting and complicated story in becoming more left-wing and more liberal and more Labour, but it's not seen in line with its economic prosperity and incomes overall, well-being rise in line there. So that suggests that in London's case, and maybe more broadly with the South, what we're seeing is maybe some negative effects of inequality actually being more important, and the benefits of runaway economic growth in the South haven't been very good, which means that when you come to think about policy responses, you have to be quite careful about levelling up. And you don't want to level up the North in the same way that level up the South and just generate more inequality within the North, which doesn't benefit people across the board. And we're not, I should be careful at this stage, arguing that people in the North are just as happy as people in the South despite lower incomes. We do kind of think that levelling up is a good idea generally, but it's not just about improving regional gross value added or regional overall income as without paying any attention to how that income is distributed within the North. I want to move on to what is a bit of a puzzle on the London side, which is how is it becoming much more Labour, and it's as a result of its liberalism, or as a result of its inequality within London. And this is where I move on to the work that isn't yet part of a working paper and is much more work in progress. And this bit of it is specifically focused on the issue of the idea that London and other core cities in the UK, the sort of big cities and university cities, have become much more liberal as a result of in-migration of graduates, young adults and graduates with high human capital, who are themselves more liberal. So there's a kind of selection effect in internal migration in Britain. And so we have this idea that young graduates move more to core cities, they're more liberal, and so the cities become more liberal. But then there's also in the literature the possibility of a contextual effect of living in a diverse city, and ethnically and cosmopolitan diverse city, making people more liberal. To get at this, we look at the British Election Study Internet Panel over these 5 years and look at the people who moved between constituencies. So panel has a big sample size, 97,000. So that enables us to get at some of the detail here, because overwhelmingly, most people didn't move. 90% of them didn't move constituencies between in these 5 years, or at least while they were in the panel. There's less than 10% moved. the rate of moving was higher amongst, and we've got graduates, non-graduates, and then split up by age group. It was higher amongst younger people. They were more likely to move, and young graduates particularly more likely to move. And they did, disproportionately move to London and other core cities. But actually, even with the young graduates, most of those who moved in the 5 years moved between constituencies that didn't involve moving to London or moving to a core city. This movement to core and university cities and these other core cities, other university cities, by the way, the smaller ones like Oxford and Cambridge and York, which have a prominent university and might be quite Remain-y, but and not but not the really bigger ones like Sheffield or Manchester or Birmingham. So we've got this pattern of migration to the cities that fits the standard narrative, but it's not that strong a pattern. But we also note that if you have to look at outmigration, an outmigration of young graduates is relatively high as well, compared with all respondents. And so young graduates are just more likely to move both into and out of London and core cities. So the net effects of that movement might not be that great. First, let's just check that the attitudes of these young graduates versus others. And you can see, actually, maybe it's easier to start with the all column. You can see that the young graduates are more Remain-y, they're more liberal, but they're slightly less left-wing, but not much in it. The ones that move to London are a bit more Remain-y and a bit more Levy, a bit more liberal than the ones that don't move. Yes, here's the ones that don't move. But there's not much difference in it compared with how this population, young graduates, are compared with the rest of the population. And it is true that the gaps between people who moved to London and people who didn't move in attitudes is bigger for the non-graduates, non-young graduates, than it is amongst the young graduates. So one way of looking at this thing, just focusing in on London, and I don't want to use up too much more time, so leave some time for Q&A, is what does the net effect of that have on London over these 5 years? So here's how Remain, percent Liberal, percent left-wing in London amongst those who stayed in London for the 5 years. And here's the attitudes for those who moved in. Well, they're more Remain-y, more liberal, not much different on left-wingness. Here's those who moved out. And you can see the group size here. This is the vast majority of the population. Most people over the time period were in London at the start and ended in London. The movement in and out is relatively small, so it's going to make a relatively little difference. It did make London more Remain-y and more liberal, but it didn't make it much less left-wing. But overwhelmingly, compared with the dominance of the narrative that London is becoming more liberal and Remain because of in-migration of young graduates, these numbers are much smaller than you might have expected and than we expected to find. And it was already the case that the stable population of London had distinct attitudes and seems to be changing in those attitudes. Now, here's my concluding slide, and I think none of it should come as a surprise. So what we found is that even though there's been major regional economic divergence in terms of incomes, hasn't produced corresponding substantial divergence on well-being, on political alienation, on social values. to the extent that there has been changes, they've been a bit more modest and a bit more complex in terms of a particularly intriguing pattern of what's going on with London, and internal migration seems to help explain a bit of that, a little bit of that, but not an awful lot. There's more work to be done trying to understand London's turn to the economic left, which I showed you starting in the early 2000s, as well as to the liberal left. And both are probably relevant to understanding why it's become such a Labour city. And going back to the main policy issue of levelling up, yes, I think we do want to see levelling up, but we need to be careful not to level up in a way that generates more inequality in the north, which might have negative implications. And let me leave you with a story going to London, back to London. There's, some of you might have seen in the news, there's a story about a couple who have been struggling economically, living in a small flat publicly provided, wanting to do refurbishment, but their incomes are stretched, partly because there are children from other relationships, I don't know how many, and in order to fund their refurbishment, to avoid what they describe as a nightmare, they had to resort to begging, and sometimes even people who didn't know. But enough of the Prime Minister. There are actually far more serious issues of people in London in overcrowded, substandard accommodation, facing extremely high cost of living. And it's perhaps not too surprising that with over 50% of the people in London in the rental sector, that not everybody is necessarily reporting much better outcomes as a result of there being some seriously rich people in London, and increasingly much richer than themselves. Let me stop there. I don't know whether I should stop the share. I guess I'll do that, but I can always bring the slides back. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I think it was a very fascinating presentation, a lot of data, a lot of food for thought behind all these figures. So let me just open the floor for questions. So is there anyone that has any question to formulate to Stephen? Ivan?
Hi, thanks for the very interesting presentation. So I'm not sure if I should say who I am or just go on with the a research fellow at the University of Birmingham, working with David Bailey on the automotive industry. But in my PhD, I also actually looked at regional inequality in the UK and separatism in Scotland. One thing, I'm not sure whether the British Social Attitude Survey now has any data that divides some of these where the geographical bases are the mayoral authorities, the newer ones, combined authorities, whether with mayors or not in London. But one thing that I found interesting is that, well, that I would think might be interesting is to see if some of the more left-wing, liberal or Remain attitudes correspond to areas that actually have a regional level of governance. The idea behind that being that in the case of Scotland or London, which has had a devolved administration longer than the combined authorities, there is actually an institutional basis to form certain and promote certain political opinions. In my opinion, if it's a democratically elected thing, it will generally, especially with high inequality, should, in some cases, actually at least end up giving out more left-wing ideas because they will be reflecting what people are concerned about, which is what has happened with the SNP in Scotland, which we see now happening in London. As a hypothesis, I could be wrong. So is that possible to look at it from that way, or the British Social Attitude Survey does not give any data and we don't actually have any data that will look at all of these values, say for the Sheffield City region, for Greater Manchester, for West Midlands, London Mayoral Authority, and so on?
Yeah, it sounds like a great idea and an interesting hypothesis. Unfortunately, one of the reasons why our analysis is so, in some senses, crude by having north, south, and then and not going into much greater detail is because the British Social Attitudes annually is about 3,000 respondents, and they do it face to face with a randomly selected 300 sampling points or so. And so a city like Sheffield, say, or wouldn't necessarily always be in even. And so you really can't, and also the sample within any particular location would be very much subject to sampling error. And as I said, we needed to do quite a bit of work thinking about smoothing over sampling error, even for the whole of the South, and particularly the whole of London, and the whole of Scotland. But maybe there's other more detailed data, and if you'd be willing to use an internet panel-based data and focus in on more recent years, something might be doable with the internet panel I was talking about, where they have small numbers of people from everywhere, but if collectively the metropolitan areas and the areas with mayors, you could see what was going on in those places specifically.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other person? Any question? Anne?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I think you've in part answered one thing that I was going to ask, in fact, which, when I think of broad regional differentials happening across the UK and the north-south divide, clearly we're in Birmingham or the Midlands, and I always think of the West Midlands as somewhere that moved from the south to the north in the 1980s. Mm-hmm. And I noticed that you had the Midlands, which is one of the key sort of battlegrounds between Conservative and Labour, both across the West and the East. I just wondered, you clearly put them in with the North and Wales. Can you speculate what might have happened if you'd had the Midlands separately as a group, from say the Northwest, Yorkshire and the Humber and the Northeast? So that was my question.
Yes, and I think it's an interesting question. I mean, most of my work in the past has been on elections and voting, and I've been quite interested in how the Midlands has become more conservative, and I think now is more conservative than both the North and the South. So there, I mean, the regions north of the Midlands in England, and and Brexit is a big part of that story, because I think Brexit was more popular in the Midlands than it was either further north or further south. And how much the West Midlands is a bit of an exception to, and particularly Birmingham is an exception to the broader Midlands, I'm not sure, because there's an urban-rural story within the Midlands there, I'm sure. But going back into the motivation for the paper, one of the reasons why we thought it was acceptable to put the Midlands and Wales and the North all together is that on some of the economic indicators, they're all very close to each other, especially with relative to the South and London, and also with respect to Scotland. So I think there's a sense in which the Midlands are distinct politically, but they might not be so distinct from the rest of the North economically. And I don't know whether that rings true and sounds fair to you.
I mean, I think you're right in terms of, the Brexit issue and there is variability, but, there's a lot of close battleground seats here. I mean, I suppose I've tended to sometimes put the East Midlands in the south and the West Midlands in the north, but I think the real change probably came at the period you looked at was, I think, 1983, which is when I think it was in that recession that the north-south divide, the line shifted to include the West Midlands in the north. And prior to that, I would have said it was in the south. And seeing as we're in the Midlands, and seeing as I live more or less on the line, I'm very interested in where people draw the line. And clearly, you know, it has implications for what you're saying. But I mean, I think I think the most striking thing to me from your analysis was how London and Scotland are just so extremely different. That chart is the one that I've got pictured on my brain at the moment. So
okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And actually this conversation is reminding me that Danny Dorling is very interested in exactly where you draw the line, and he has drawn the line differently for different projects, and has different ideas about why you would want to draw the line, and drawing and changing how you draw the line over time.
Yeah, I've had conversations with Danny about that because I live so close to the line.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
It's always entertaining.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Anne. Any more questions? Yeah.
I see a couple of hands raised. Yeah.
Yeah. Pei?
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for the very interesting talk. Yes. So I think you showed a picture about the health inequality between London and other regions, and I think there's not much inequality between London and non-London regions. So do you think ethnic minorities could be a reason for that? You know, I think ethnic minority people have worse health outcomes, and I think London has a very high proportion of ethnic minorities, especially I think the Black African and the Black Caribbean have pretty bad health outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's a possibility. You're right. London and the South have more ethnic minorities, and so potentially that might be part of the reason. That's something I could look into actually with these data, and I'm aware that the whole story, because it's at such a macro level, is skating over ethnicity, and that might be useful to try and unpack that a bit more. My instinct, though, is that whilst there is a difference, it's probably not big enough, but I would want to look into it. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Pei. Simon?
Thanks, Raquel, and thanks very much, Stephen. I enjoyed that. So we had a Fulbright chair join us a couple of years ago, Stefan Wieler, actually from Colorado State University, and he noted one of the things you note, which is a convergence in some of the economic and social data up until about sort of the mid-2000s, 2007, 2008, which was the financial crash. And after the convergence, a very distinctive divergence, and he sees it across probably more clearly and across a wider set of data than you've presented. But one of the things he observed, which is where my question comes from, is that he observes that there are very different time lags over which different phenomena tend to evolve. And he's quite focused on social mobility. And he notes that social mobility is in terms of what opportunities are accessible by what group of the population in what place. It really is connected to housing and to schooling, but takes place over a much longer time period than things like GVA and some of the economic indicators. And one of his suggestions was that the end of the convergence was partly due to a very distinctive change in where household communities and the house prices almost sort of went back to pushing people into ghettos, where they were then left with much poorer schooling. And for both ethnic groups and low income groups of all ethnicities, it limited their social mobility over a long period from then onwards. So his point is the spatial, the housing, the schooling were connected to these, but over a different time period. Have we got any indication of that in the data so far? Or if not, is it to do with the variety of data or the timescales over which you're looking?
Firstly, thank you for that. Who was the person you mentioned? Because I'm not sure I'm familiar with that work.
We can make an introduction. He's in Colorado State University. And he's an economist. He's done some very good papers on this. Yeah.
So it's maybe partly because I've been coming at this from somebody who studies public opinion and elections and social attitudes at a broader level or at a very micro level on an individual level. And I haven't previously been thinking so much about these things on a regional basis or related to dynamic effects of housing policies and education policies and so on. But what you say makes sense. I'm also mindful that when I was talking about some of the migration stuff and London becoming more left-wing, we've also got issues of housing authorities moving people out of London because they can't provide enough social housing in London. And there are, I suspect, lots of processes going on in terms of restructuring of social policies that are important here. But certainly the British Social Attitude Survey wouldn't be very good at getting at them. Whether something like Understanding Society and the British Household Panel study would be better at it, I don't know. The issue with those is often that measurement of social attitudes and political values and political behaviour are very thin on the ground, typically. So then linking it all back to those kinds of things is quite tricky.
Yeah,
have I answered your question? Because there was a lot in it that
If you are interested on social
there was a lot. Yeah, no, but thank you. No, that's really helpful. Yeah, it's a complex area. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Stephen, if you are interested in social mobility, we had recently, I think it was 2 weeks ago, a seminar by Bertha Rothenkohl from the University of Sheffield on social mobility in the UK. So the blog with the video is available in our website. Philip, you had a question? Philip?
Hi, Stephen.
Hi, Philip.
Hi, great presentation, lovely, lots of great stuff in there.
Thank you.
Your final comment I noticed on the slides then, okay, we've got economic inequalities, but if we're going to level up, we've got to do it kind of in a very nuanced manner. So on the basis of the evidence that you are putting forward today, can you give some guidelines as to what you meant by that?
On one level, no, because what I got today was still quite speculative ultimately in terms of what is going on in London. We don't actually pin it down to the inequality issue. The other thing is, and as I've already also admitted, that the regional stuff is quite crude, and I know that some of the more serious discussions of levelling up already acknowledge that it's not the whole of the North that needs levelling up. It's parts of the North and Midlands, and yeah, and when some of the debates of the allocation of money to different authorities recently and how political that has already pointed out problems of not allocating money to very poor boroughs in London. And so I kind of realized that whilst some of what I've been saying is supportive of that agenda of looking in more detail exactly where the money goes, and it's not uniform within cross places. There's a limit to how much my analysis can really do in terms of driving any detail on policy there. But I suppose the other broader thing is if it speaks to concerns about inequality, it it also suggests that we need to be thinking about not just allocation of funds to places in order to level up, but thinking about the broader tax and redistribution and public services and public benefit system too, and the overall distributional effect of all the government's economic policy, which might be relevant here. But yeah, it's there's a limit to how much this particular work can speak to all of that.
Thank you very much. Actually, Philip has stolen my question. So very, very similar question I had. So it's 2 o'clock now. So I just want to thank you again, Stephen, for presenting today in our seminar series. I think it was a very interesting research. I just encourage any person attending the seminar, if you want to contact him, because it's so much information there. I'm sure many of our colleagues are interested in part of your presentation. Please do. And you will soon have a blog summarizing a bit the seminar, and also with the video of today's seminar for you to have a look again if you are interested in. Thank you very much to all of you for attending the seminar today, and thanks again to Stephen for presenting our seminar series. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks for the comments and coming. Thanks. Bye-bye.